Hi, welcome back. My name is Rebecca, and today I am going to start preserving a year's worth of tomatoes. So I'm going to can a batch of these tomatoes with you and also show you how I get them prepped for the freeze dryer. I have enough tomatoes here for a year, but I don't think you want to stick around for the full year's supply of canning. So I'll give you the abbreviated version and share with you how I get all these tomatoes ready so we have fresh tomatoes all year long. So I'm gonna get some stuff going around here and I'll talk to you along the way about the process and also some tips for canning tomatoes if you don't have a garden. When you're canning tomatoes, there is a lot of water involved. It is a sloppy mess. So wear your dirtiest, oldest apron. Don't wear a white shirt. I don't know what I'm doing, but I have a white shirt on. And do be prepared for a little bit of a mess, but it will totally be worth it. So I'm just getting this first pot of water going here. I'm only filling it up about halfway. So this pot of water is just going to be used for peeling the tomatoes. I have the stock pot on the stove and I am going to get my water bath canner filled up and going. So it's actually going to be a little while until we need the water bath canner, but it takes a pretty long time for it to warm up and start boiling. So I like to get it going right away. The deal with water bath canning versus pressure canning is whether or not there is enough acid in the food. So with tomatoes, we add lemon juice and add the acid, which makes it safe for water bath canning. Before I get these going in the hot water to peel, I'm going to just wash them off first. Because A, it's always a good idea to keep your food nice and clean when you are preserving it, but also I want to save these skins because I am going to freeze dry them because tomato skins freeze dry really nicely. And the water's boiling, so I'm going to add these tomatoes one at a time carefully. You could either use a slotted spoon or if you feel comfortable, you can just put it in there. Just make sure to get the tomato nice and close to the water so you don't splash yourself. And we're going to boil these for 1 minute or until the skins start to split. I do set a timer because it's really easy to let a minute go by quickly and not know that it's way past time. So at a minute, I will take these out and put them right into the ice bath, and then the skins peel right off. And then I'm gonna fill up this big bowl with some ice and a little bit of water, so that way we can stop the cooking process when it comes time to peel the tomatoes. So these are going right into the ice bath, and I usually let them sit in the cold water for, I don't know, 30 seconds or so, just to let them cool off, because they are a little hot, of course, to the touch. So we'll let these sit in here for a minute and then we'll just start peeling these skins right off. Oh, here's a good one. So you can see how the skin has split on this one. That's an indication that it's definitely ready to come out of the hot water. This is a crushed tomato recipe that of course calls for peeling the tomato, cutting off the tops of the tomato, and coring it. I am saving the peels and the cores for the freeze dryer because that's part of the tomato that I would eat anyway. If I were just slicing this, I probably wouldn't even really core it that much. And I don't want to waste that. Of course, if you don't have a freeze dryer, you don't have to worry about that. But if you do have a freeze dryer, or even better, if you have a friend with a freeze dryer, you can totally save all the parts of your tomato and then freeze dry it for later use. Now, I am going to cut off this top right here because that part I don't want to use, of course. But other than that, I'm going to use the whole tomato. So I'll show you the whole freeze drying stuff in a little bit, but let's look at how to chop these tomatoes. I'm slicing the tomato to the side of this little round top part. So that way it's, a little bit easier to get that core out. So all I'm doing then is just slicing it like this and getting the core out. And now technically there could be a little bit of wasted flesh there, but because I'm freeze drying them, it's not that big of a deal. And I'm just slicing this little part off here. So that way I can get rid of this and then the rest of the tomato can be used. So the core I'm just throwing into another bowl over here, and then I'm just chopping this up. Now the recipe calls for quartered tomatoes, but some of these are giant, so I am chopping it a little bit more than that. You also want, like this one, you also want to look for any like funky spots. So this tomato kind of has something weird going on here, if you can see that. I'm gonna cut that off. This is a really good example of how you do not need to have a garden or a homestead to be able to preserve a year's worth of tomatoes. So while I chop up these tomatoes, I'll just share a little bit about these tomatoes because I did not grow these. It was my goal to grow enough tomatoes to preserve for a year, but that was a huge fail. My garden is on the struggle bus. It is incredibly hot here. We are not getting enough rain. We have a big leaf-footed bug problem. So I am getting some tomatoes, but not really enough to preserve or can. So what I did is I bought these tomatoes from a local farm, and that is a really great way to get fresh food for preservation. If you don't have a garden, if something happened to your garden, you can go to local farms, and often they will give you a discount if you buy in bulk. And in fact, this particular farm, Double R Farm out of Maple Hill, North Carolina, they sell boxes of canning tomatoes. So these are tomatoes that were not good enough, I guess, for the stores. They have like little dents. Sometimes they have a little bit of a bruise on them, but you can still use these for canning. Honestly, I'm not even really sure what's wrong with these. I haven't seen a problem with any of them. I would buy these tomatoes at the store, but for whatever reason, they just didn't make the cut. So you can buy them really cheap. What's important about that whole spiel is that if you have these like dreams of canning food and preserving your own food, but you don't have the space for a garden or you don't have the time for a garden, you can totally buy all this stuff from a local farm or a farmer's market and preserve it yourself. Okay, the peeling and the chopping is done. So maybe the most important thing I even have to say, other than using a tested recipe, is to clean as you go. So the stock pot that I use for boiling to get the tomato skins off, I'm just going to wash, and we'll use that for cooking them down. Then I'm going to throw all of the scraps in a bowl to take out to the composter, and then I'll set the skins and the other parts aside for freeze drying later. We'll get to that in a few minutes. But what's really cool about this is nothing has gone to waste. So I have compost, I have tomatoes for canning, I have tomatoes for freeze drying. So every single bit of the tomato is going back into my garden or into our bodies. And it's a really cool way to have complete control over your food. When you buy food from the store, which I do all the time, this isn't saying you shouldn't be doing that, but when you buy food from the store, you don't have a lot of control over what goes in it or what happens to all of the byproducts. But when you do this at home, you get to control it completely and use it in the ways that serve you and your family best. Okay, so it's time to start cooking these down. So the recipe for this is over on the National Center for Home Food Preservation, but essentially what we're going to do is take about 1/6 of these tomatoes, put it into this pot and crush them, and then slowly start adding more tomatoes as they cook down. And then we will boil it for 5 minutes once all of the tomatoes are added. You will only need to crush the first batch that you put in here, and the rest of them will cook down as needed for canning later. The tomatoes boiled for 5 minutes, so now it is time to start canning them. So I'm gonna move the jars from the canner to the island. Again, I would recommend, if possible, trying to keep this closer to your stove. I just can't get my camera set up that way. The recipe for this calls for either pints or quarts. I prefer to can pints because I don't always need a full quart of tomatoes. But if you check out the link in the description box below, it'll tell you all the information you need for how long to process your tomatoes, whether you are using pints, quarts, or what your elevation is. The first thing that we need to do is add acid to the jars. So tomatoes need added acid in order to be safe for water bath canning. So the National Center for Home Food Preservation always recommends using bottled lemon juice because if you use a regular lemon, the pH of that varies depending on the type of lemon and the lemon itself, but this is pretty standardized and regulated. So you should only really use store-bought lemon juice for canning. And since I am using pints, it calls for 1 tablespoon. Now, one thing that I recommend is putting the lemon juice in all of your jars first. Because one time I did this and I was adding the lemon juice and then I added the tomatoes like per jar. So I did lemon juice, tomatoes, lemon juice tomatoes, and then I started to lose track of whether or not I put the lemon juice in the jars. So I would recommend getting all the jars out, then putting the lemon juice in all the jars, and then filling all the jars with tomatoes. So that way you know you haven't missed a step. All right, let's fill these jars up. So hot food always goes in hot jars. I like to use a slotted spoon just to make sure I'm getting all the flesh of the tomatoes first. Sometimes I forget to do that. I just use a ladle. And then I end up with a jar or two that has a lot of liquid and not a lot of actual tomatoes in it. So I'm gonna get as much tomato in each jar as I can, and then we will top it off with juice. Last time I did this, last night, I did not have, it was really annoying actually, I had enough tomatoes for 8.5 jars. I needed 9. So hopefully I have enough this time. And if I have too much, no problem, I'll just use it up for dinner tonight. The jars are full, and now what I want to do is press the tomatoes down to make sure they're packed nice and tightly. So if you have a lot of liquid in the jar, what can happen after you process them in the water bath canner is you can get what's called fruit float, where the fruit floats to the top and the liquid's on the bottom. It isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's still safe to use and eat. It just doesn't look as pretty. I'm using this tool. I'll link all these tools in the description box below for you so you can get them if you need them to figure out what the headspace is. So this has little notches and this one's at a 1/2 inch, but I'm going to take this around the rim, and this one's a little bit too high. It's knocking into the fruit, so I'm gonna take a little bit out. I'm making a huge mess with some of these, but luckily we can clean it up. Going to take the other end of this and I'm going to de-bubble the jars. So I like to slide it in 3 places, and this just makes sure that there's not any air bubbles taking up space. And then once we de-bubble them, go back and check the headspace and adjust again. My house is getting noisy, so I'm switching to voiceover. I am now wiping the rims of the jars with a damp paper towel, and this is really important because if you have any food on the rim of the jar, the lid will not be able to seal. So I'm wiping everything down. I'm screwing the lid on until it stops on its own, and then about a 1/4 turn more, and no more than that, because if it's too tight, then the lid can buckle. And the moment we've all been waiting for, everything is going into the water bath canner. So there should be, once you put the cans all the way down into the canner, about 1 to 2 inches of water above the cans. And I am processing mine for 35 minutes, and that's because I'm at sea level. So check out the link below from the National Center for Home Food Preservation for how long you should process yours. And while I wait for that, I am getting all the other parts of the tomatoes ready for freeze drying. Now, there's actually not a whole lot to say or show about this because freeze drying is so simple. I am going to flash freeze all of these parts of the tomatoes because I actually already have a batch of tomatoes from last night in the freeze dryer. So I'm just chopping everything up, making sure it's, maybe at maximum about a 1/2 inch in size, and then putting all the extra parts on either a cookie sheet and a couple on a plate just because I didn't have room in my freezer. And I'm freezing them first for a couple of hours just so they don't freeze in one giant clump. And then later in the evening, I move these from the freezer into freezer bags. Now you can see here, these are the tomatoes from last night. They are in the freeze dryer processing. They will take a while, maybe even a couple of days, because my freeze dryer is in the garage and it's pretty hot in my garage. But by freezing the tomatoes prior, it'll actually cut down the time later when it comes to freeze dry the other batches. And the tomatoes are out of the canner. These need to sit with the rings on for about 24 hours. And then I'll take the rings off, wipe the jars off again, and then label them and put them in the pantry so we have fresh tomatoes for a year. Now, I was not able to get the tomatoes into the freeze dryer for this video, but I will show those to you soon. So make sure you subscribe so you can stay in the loop and check out how those freeze-dried tomatoes turned out. Thank you so much for stopping by today and canning with me. I hope you feel inspired to begin or to continue your home food preservation journey, no matter who you are, where you live, or what you do. I'll see you guys again next time.